Welcome to my channel, Delightful Stories. I'll be happy if you subscribe to my channel and like it. Enjoy watching and don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments about the story. Nikki easily slipped off the big bus and looked around. Today was her first day of school at the new university, where she had transferred to this year since she and her family had to move to the capital because of her father's job. Before that, Nikki and her parents also lived in a major regional metropolis. However, comparing that city to the capital was, of course, pointless, too fast, paced compared to Nikki's cheerful but slightly sleepy city. The girl was transferred immediately to the third year of the management faculty, without any problems. Of course, Nikki graduated with a gold medal. She also completed the first 2 years of her studies at her former place, being a straight student with a higher scholarship. However, Nikki was not proud of her achievements. She always behaved modestly, knowing that a reasonable and quiet demeanor is much more beautiful than constant bravado and loud statements of her own success. Outwardly, Nikki was very attractive. She had a slim, trim figure, dark hair in little rings down to her waist, and incredible depths of dark brown eyes, which seemed to have a slight cherry tint at certain angles of light. However, the girl dressed very modestly and discreetly. No screaming shades in her clothes and makeup. And her closet consisted of the simplest basic everyday items. And today Nikki did not dress up in any special way for her first day of school, and preferred to wear a simple white blouse and light gray jeans. She completed her outfit with a plain stocking-net cardigan from the mass market. To her misfortune, the girl was immediately spotted by a local trio of rich students, the Majors, whom everyone called the tar behind their backs. Most ordinary students knew that it was better not to mess with these buddies, otherwise they would stick to you like tar and bully you until they drove a person to an extreme state. Nikki was just walking past the large flowering lawn that sprawled beside the university building when she heard several male voices behind her. These voices were not the least bit embarrassed, discussing Nikki's appearance. "Look who it is," said the first. "She must have mistaken the university for a flea market for hobos. She probably doesn't know they don't give out free clothes here." She didn't hear the second, slightly higher voice. She'd come to wear it in her head anyway, decided to masquerade as a student, to work for free. Nikki could not stand it, turned around and turned to the speaker. "You young people, you mean me?" The girl saw 3 very young men, guys her age, dressed in trendy tracksuits from the latest collections of prestigious foreign brands. On their feet they sported sneakers with a high platform, complementing the image of relaxed students on vacation. "No, we are so abstract." Smiling nastily, pronounced apparently a third of them with highly coiffed hair, a blonde shade, as if lazily stretched out in response, Nikki. "But in the abstract, you know, the honeypot has been out of circulation for a couple of seasons now, right? I heard Ariana Grande gave it up a long time ago. But if you still like music for little girls, then..." The guy with the boat's face went pale in a flash and slowly stretched out. "You've got some nerve, haven't you?" said one of the guys who talked about the flea markets. "All right, you beggars, take your walk. I forgive you for not knowing." "Ignorance of what?" Nikki asked me sarcastically. "What did you 3 jerks catch up on?" Suddenly the second, with a big diamond earring in his ear and multicolored strands of dark hair. "No, did you hear what she told me?" "Calm down," said the first one in a cold tone. "That lunatic is going to get her. Just be patient." Nikki just burst out laughing in response to the boy's threats and quietly walked into the classroom. The tall head boy glued his white teeth together angrily. "You see what a greyhound you got? The face is fine, of course, but I would have used his tongue for quite another purpose." "Cool it, Dan," said the word calmly. He was the unspoken leader of their company. "Remember, women are impertinent until you point them out where they belong. That's what my father always says, especially ones like her. White trash. She doesn't understand what rung of the food ladder she's on yet, but we'll help her get her bearings quickly. After that, The three of them headed off to the local mall. They didn't really have to go to a lecture. The fact was that William, Sam, and Dan came from very wealthy business families. That's why the guys believed that they were not just the golden youth, but literally the kings of the city. William, the smartest and most dangerous of the trio, was a blood nephew to the governor of the region. He grew up in luxury and in full prosperity. He could afford everything that his classmates had not yet even dreamed of. His father was a prominent member of the board of directors of a large state-level law firm. And so when it came to playing with the law, the young prankster had no equal. Sam was crazy about Korean culture, and he had every right to be. His parents worked at the embassy. Both were experts in international relations and easily dined with ambassadors from Eastern countries. Sam himself had traveled to both Korea and Western Europe more than once. And because of these trips, each time he brought a new portion of revelations about how the progressive youth society lived on the other side of the ocean. At the same time, the young man brings in his own image elements of modern fashion trends. Wyatt looked always bright and creative. One thing oppressed Sam's parents. The guy was catastrophically guided and easily succumbed to another's, not always positive influence, which in fact happened to him. When young Sam met William and Dan and became part of the resin himself, Dan, on the other hand, was a shining example of the very real major, craving nothing from life, as all sorts of pleasures and entertainment are paramount. The guy valued material culture and in its most negative way, manifestation, expensive, fancy clothes, the latest model phone, the coolest girls in the underground parties. Dan cared about all that more than education and a bright future, which, in his opinion, might never come. Dan believed he had to live here and now and make the best of every hour because he was allowed to. His mother, Dan, was a district judge, and his father was a financial expert, advising the nation's leading banks and industries. Often the three of them allowed themselves to be overdone. Their eccentric antics and pranks on the faculty were legendary. There were legends in the university, and it was said that the TAR had patrons in the higher teaching staff, to whom the parents of these cronies paid an extra tidy sum per semester, so that their child could safely pass from course to course without the burden of a full examination. Otherwise, it was impossible to explain how these three managed to get 100's automatic passes in many tests and examinations, while appearing at the lectures and practical classes at best, a couple of times a month. Some of the real honor students were perplexed and regularly stressed. After all, they had to study hard and persistently to get the highest score for their knowledge, while time after time got high marks just by showing up for another exam. I mumbled a couple of 3 words on my exam ticket in front of the teachers. The trio invariably left with A's in their report card, which they then openly bragged about standing in the hallway, thus making the other students nervous. The trouble was that the simple guys had absolutely no evidence that could confirm the existence of a criminal conspiracy between the teachers, department staff, or someone from the rector's office and the Golden Trio. And without evidence, they themselves risked being thrown out of the university like a cork from an open champagne bottle. That's why most students had to endure the disgusting behavior of these cronies in their presence on the faculty day after day. As for the resin members themselves, William, Sam, or Dan weren't particularly interested in what others thought of them. Each of them was mostly involved in his own person, so they had no time to think about their behavior, much less about how those they pranked or trolled on a daily basis felt. It was on the basis of the similarity of their selfish characters that the young men came together, so quickly forming their own powerful circle, independent of anyone else. Over the years of study, their friendship only strengthened, as all three had about the same set of values and hobbies in life, among which the first place was expensive parties, socializing with beautiful girls, and, of course, jokes, funny from their point of view clips. The buddies liked to edit, adding funny voiceovers to the torments of their victims in the frame, after which they posted ready-made videos on social networks. What happened afterwards to the reputation and morale of the unfortunate student who had unwittingly been caught in such a video was not usually of interest to the tar, as a rule. They mistakenly believed that they had exclusive power and permissiveness in the university thanks to the patronage of their parents, and possibly someone else directly related to the educational process. The guys thought they could afford to pick any level of victim, from the average student to a respected faculty member. Sometimes their pranks were quite innocent in nature, such as the time they lured all the female teachers into the auditorium on the 8th of March, and then rolled a huge cake in there, from which instantly later 3 hot male dancers jumped out at once and performed a frank dance in front of the aging ladies. But most of the time the golden students made very harsh jokes, allowing themselves to be scathingly sarcastic towards fellow students and teachers, setting up the most real harassment on certain students. Especially those students who dared to give the hated trio any kind of backlash were subjected to harsh tests. These 3 could not even imagine that someone decided to go against them directly, and with such daredevils always dealt particularly harshly. Such a story just happened to one of the students last month, when Nikki had not yet transferred to a new institution. The girl found out about what had happened later, and what she had heard made her very angry. Robert had always been a very quiet, sometimes even too quiet student. He did not disturb anyone, and was not particularly friendly with anyone, preferring to spend most of his time in the university library. Attention with the little guy had been attracted for a long time, but the mysterious trio guarded the prank. With that, the kid was in for a sweet treat. They wanted to arrange something special for Robert that would both make a lasting memory for the student crowd and boost their ranking on the video hosting site. In the end, they decided to prank the guy as follows. The rich people incited one of their acquaintances from the circle of aspiring models, so that under the guise of a simple girl to get a part-time job in the student library. She had to fall in love with a celebrity, and then at the party, on the occasion of Students' Day, to humiliate him publicly, showing his true face. But the ill-fated student's plans did not come to fruition. Robert was far from stupid, and that is why he quickly guessed that his new friend so insistently proposing him a relationship was in fact a young model in the genre, shooting exclusively for men's magazine. Immediately, as soon as the guy unmasked his unrequited love, he walked up to Smalls himself and in the middle of the hallway threw in their faces candid photos with the supposed librarian, and along the way called them dumbasses. That would have been fine, but there were plenty of other students around. And such a public insult the friends and could not tolerate, of course. The 3 of them didn't bother. They made a deal with the professional guys from Falco Sports who beat him up for a pretty decent amount of money. So he was hospitalized for 3 months and missed a 6-month session at the same time. There was no one to stand up for the guy. He came from a remote village where he was being raised by his grandmother alone. Robert did not go to the police. He was well aware that with such connections as the tar, he could not expect justice from the law. Sure, after a few months, the boy himself transferred to another city. He was disgusted to be even in the same classroom with such scoundrels. The student body remembered Roberta as one of the first guys who dared to fight back against the exploding threesome. At the same time, they were even more afraid of them, because they realized that if they had not cost him the athletes that had almost left him disabled, then they could think of anything. But as they say, their own shirt is closer to their bodies, so everyone was silent again. So what have we got? Businesslike reasoned William, once again discussing with his friends the new girl in their group. She had no money, of course. That's 100. Her dad's an invalid ex-paratrooper, and her mom works as a letter carrier. I guess she doesn't earn 1 million either. The mages laughed out loud, openly mocking the parents they found. She doesn't have a car either. She takes the bus here every day. The clothes are from Canada, in a word, poverty, so there's no point in trying to get them at all. We'll hit 'em where it hurts. What if her daddy gives us a hard time? Sam asked cautiously. No, but he's a paratrooper. Even if he was, he'll tell later to his friends, his servicemen. William snapped at him. What will they do to us, Sam? Yeah, folks will sue them so badly. They'll have to spend the rest of their lives in jail. No, we'll be fine. So how about we get her divorced for something? Dan hinted unequivocally, flirting with his wide-ranging rights to the fancy piercing. What do you want? Asked William reasonably. Do you really want to get yourself dirty for this one? You don't have enough girls at the club. You want a thrill. No, it's kind of imported. The blond guy tried to justify himself. Come on, Dan, use your head. Threatened William. I don't get it right now. I get it, he replied gloomily. The next day before the lectures, when everyone has already entered the classroom and settled in their seats, Nikki suddenly found a huge bag with a fashionable label on her desk. Surprised, she carefully opened it and looked inside. It was stuffed to the top, full of all kinds of clothes and all, judging by the measures, was a designer. Whirled leather sweaters, denim skirts, shorts, travel blouses, fancy plaid pants, and even exquisite underwear. All of these appeared diligently stacked in an even pile. What's this? Surprisingly looking around, Nikki asked. Maybe one of the fifth-year girls had forgotten, suggested one of the students. And then he whistled quietly, peeking inside the bag. No, it's definitely impossible to leave this by accident. There's a fortune's worth of clothes in here. What are you going to do with it? If I were you, I'd take it all for myself. Why, what's gone down is gone up. She smiled. Nikki just frowned, anxious. She'll have to take it to the dean's office after class, she concluded. I'm sure that's the first place the landlady would go. At this point, the unfortunate trio poured into the classroom, holding their phone at the ready with the camera on. They were ready to film everything in detail. What's going on? What about you? William smirked at the girl. Don't you understand? She answered glumly. Oh, you've got to be kidding me, haven't you? How about that? Unpleasantly stretching his vowels, stretched Dan. We went through all the best designer second-hand clothes for you, so you'd have something to wear when you walk down the street. Aren't you ashamed to try it on? The blonde guy was teasing her. I think I got your size right, don't I? The lingerie on top, that's a special compliment from me. Sam, who had his phone in his hand, silently filmed what was happening, trying to get a close-up of Nikki's face. God, you're all such losers, aren't you? Shouted the girl in their face. We're the losers. We're the losers, interjected William impudently. Not at all. You're the only one of us who's broke. You know it's a shame to go into the bakery down the street the way you do, don't you? But we don't blame you. The poor need to be respected. The poor need help, so we do. And you'd better thank us, silly, for taking care of yours. You got it all on camera. The guy with the colorful hair, chewing his gum. All right, keep filming. The real show is about to begin, said Nikki, and quietly got up from behind the desk. What happened afterwards became a real parable in the whole faculty. Nikki took out the underwear lying on top of the bag and, approaching Dan, in one movement deftly pulled his badge over his praying face. The girl stepped aside to admire the spectacle that had happened. Dan's face literally twisted with anger. At first, out of surprise, he did not even immediately understand what had happened to him. Sam automatically turned the camera right on him, and William, who was caught in the frame, could not hold back a slight smile. All three of you are just losers hiding behind your parents' money, Nikki said coldly. If it weren't for the rustling and the papers in your pockets, you would have been kicked out long ago with disgrace. We all know that without your patrons, you are no more than a zero without a stick. That's for bullying the other guys and for not stopping, even when you realize you look like a bunch of idiots. Dan, all this time, mercilessly warring with the goofless goalie, finally managed to undo the puff, seeing that his friend did not stop filming the guy, as if to Satan. Sam, are you still filming? What about it? Is it live? Sam answered, as if nothing had happened. Apparently, he did not pay much attention to what was going on, preferring to perform the task of cameraman, which had been assigned to him earlier. Dan turned to William in helpless anger. He was standing far away. His face was blacker than a cloud. "You'll pay," he hissed, looking at Nikki. "Oh, what a big mistake you've made. You have no idea what will happen to you. What are you going to do? Score like Robert?" The girl looked bravely into his eyes. "Don't be shy. Tell everyone on the air how you ordered it to the karate guys from the sports department." At that moment, William looked around and noticed how some of the students smiled understandingly. Then several of the girls, one by one, rose from their seats and clapped their hands, applauding Nikki's courage. They were joined by the rest of the boys, and within seconds the entire study group was standing and applauding the girl. William would have liked to say something in response, but at that time the teacher suddenly entered the classroom, and the Golden Mages involuntarily had to sit down on their places. The whole trio continued to glare at Nikki with fierce eyes. Now they would be more subtle, and the upstart would eventually get his way, so thought William. From the side, watching Nikki, "No one dares to go against us. And whoever dares, it's his own fault," pondered the Terror leader's new dirty business. As a result, Trinity decided to organize a massive costume party the following weekend, entrance to which was only possible by list, and only a special dress code was decided to choose the total Richie Black style. For the feast, the Mages rented for one night the most expensive and trendy nightclub in the capital, so the young people who came there could have a good time. There was only one nuance to what was going on. In all the invitations sent out by email, a separate paragraph stated exactly how the guests were to be dressed in all but one destination. The calculation of the resin was such that the ignorant girl would surely show up at the party in some humble old rags, thereby completely violating the dress code. But the security guard who was to let the young people into the club had been warned in advance that this particular girl should have been allowed in. And there they would humiliate her in front of all their friends once and for all, showing her marginal place. Nikki herself, having received the electronic invitation card, was not at all eager to go anywhere, all the more knowing that the organizers of all this action is the ill-fated trio. Nevertheless, the new friends of fellow students were able to convince her to go to a night party. True, they also forgot to warn her about what style of dress should be appropriate to the club. This, however, was not malicious. They just didn't know that that was not part of her invitation. When the hour X came and the first guests began to flock to the club, the Mages got pretty excited. The show promised to be unforgettable in every way. The club was decorated so that the newly arrived boys and girls had their jaws dropped off completely. And this concerned both ordinary fellow students of the TAR and representatives of the young elite. Everywhere on the lower floor were hung golden platinum garlands, interspersed with a grouping of the finest black tulle with glittering Swarovski rhinestones. The garlands were folded in the shape of animal heads, and here and there wolves, deer, and foxes looked at the guests from the ceiling. In the middle of the hall, there was a high pedestal on which 3 gilded and upholstered velvet armchairs were set. They were supposed to be where all 3 hosts of the party would be seated at the climax of the party. The gang planned to hold an ostentatious lynching right in the middle of this luxury. Sort of like a Cinderella tale, only in reverse. Naturally, to add even more tension to the plan, hidden cameras were specially installed in the hall, the contents of which were immediately broadcast on a new platform where all those privy to the details of the operation and just ordinary viewers could immediately give their opinions or donate a certain amount of money to the trio for the development of the channel. Slowly but surely the number of delighted guests increased, and the hall gradually began to fill with a crowd of assorted young men in expensive suits and evening gowns. But Comrade Black intended the clothes to be very dark, understated colors, but with sure emphasis on its expensive nature and the overall wealth of its owner. It is not surprising, therefore, that elegant evening gowns of girls and older ladies were complemented by precious jewelry, and the strict tuxedos and three-piece suits of the men, gold watches and diamond cufflinks. In addition, each of the participants in this impromptu ball was given a mask, a gilded cardboard in the shape of some animal. According to the status in the hall, also stirred deer: wolves, foxes, panthers, and gentle, fluttering doe bunnies. The party organizers themselves carried special masks. All three had a gilded piece of cardboard representing the face of a lion. Such a maneuver was intended to emphasize once again their status and exclusivity as full kings of this large urban jungle. And it was in this mask that they were going to tear Nikki apart in front of everyone. The music played at full power, gradually intensifying their basses. The dancing guests went more and more into a frenzy, allowing their bodies in expensive outfits to move arbitrarily to the enchanted, hypnotic music. Time passed, however, and Nikki still did not appear. All three pals left their seats in the center of the hall for a while and quietly made their way to the main exit to have a smoke and think about how to proceed. It was time for the climax of the party, where everything had been premeditated and its main star never arrived. She probably wasn't coming. Sam voiced his thoughts to all three of them. We've been waiting a long time. Maybe she's figured out there's something wrong. I doubt it, Dan mouthed, taking another puff. Why would she suddenly snap? If someone had told her about the suits, then it was entirely possible. Pondered aloud William. But I don't think it could have made any difference. Even if she showed up in her most dressed-up clothes, all her huffs would be instantly lined up. Who she is compared to us, nobody. Cheapskate. At that moment, Trinity spotted in far light, not far from the club, and the next minute, a huge black Mercedes business class car pulled around the corner. I don't recognize the license plate number, said a shocked Dan. Does anybody know whose car it is? I don't remember one of ours, Sam responded. All three of them looked at each other. They were waiting for a luxury car to be parked and were at a loss as to who owned it. The foreign car slowly pulled up to the entrance of the club and carefully pulled up to the entrance of the club and carefully pulled into the allocated parking space. The door on the passenger side swung open, and at once all three young rich men felt a cold, slippery trickle of sweat running down their backs. Out of the car, like a swallow, jumped an unknown beauty in an exquisite evening gown, the color of the starry sky. A tall hairdo bared a long, slender neck, on which a huge pendant made of a limited yellow diamond framed by tiny diamond droplets shone with a yellow sliver of moonlight. The beauty's hands were tight, draped in tall black gloves on her left arm, also shone with a diamond bracelet on her shoulders in unknown homes, developing in the night breeze. A long silk scarf hand, painted in the shape of the night sky. What a queen this one is! Shrieked this admiration Dan, but then immediately added hoarsely that when the girl turned around on her face too, there was a golden mask and elegant gold paper seemed to be the thinnest dense layer, laying on her skin, not allowing to make out the features of her face. One thing was abundantly clear. This girl thought herself neither more nor less. And the queen of this ball, by the way the mask on her repeated the shape of a lioness's head. Only now did the boys notice a tall young man, broad-shouldered, emerge from the back of the car. A handsome man, had refined manners and behaved like a real gentleman. He was not wearing a mask, but he wore an expensive black suit which fitted perfectly with the status of local guests. He easily took his companion under his arm as he approached the door of the club. It was obvious that both of these characters were extremely wealthy and knew their worth. The mages, not knowing how to behave, decided to personally greet such influential guests. Just in case popping out of their hiding place, the guys hurriedly stifled their cigarettes and approached the new arrivals. "Good evening, madam." "Sir," said William jokingly to the broad-shouldered man. He thought he had seen that face before. Dan, stammering with excitement, awakened. "Just tell me your last name, please." And Sam stood silently beside him, He was very curious to know who was hiding under the mask of a socialite. "Good evening, sir," said a pleasant woman's voice, and a thin hand darted upward to throw back the golden mask in the next second. William, who'd been thinking of some original compliment for the beautiful stranger all this time, suddenly swallowed his tongue, his own face on the show making a stark contrast to the snow-white versus shirt he was wearing that evening. "Nikki," she solemnly announced, then held out her black-gloved hand to William. "Nice to meet you," he answered, bringing Nikki's hand to his lips. Brian Zaitsev introduced himself to the girl's companion. Zaitsev repeatedly asked astonished Sam. "The same Brian who had breakfast with Elon Musk himself last month?" The man laughed and shook his head a little embarrassedly, confirming the Major's hunch. It turned out that the young man was one of the most advanced research engineers in the field of digital and nanotechnology. The promising young businessman Brian, by the time he was 27 years old, had financial assets, the exact amount of which was calculated in figures with 8 zeros. He had met Nikki the previous year at an international conference for young scientists, where she had come with her previous study group. The young people began communicating and soon discovered that they had many interests in common. A mutual sympathy followed, and the young people began dating little by little. Meanwhile, Dan, who was shocked by what he saw, turned his attention to the other man and slowly got out of the car. The guy's eyes widened even more in front of him. Leaning on a quality cane clearly custom-made stood none other than Nikki's father, the same disabled paratrooper. Only now did the Major realize what it was that confused him so. In this car, on the dashboard covering everything through the windows of the car, was specially oriented for people with disabilities. And that is why the steering of this foreign car was completely manual. Only a person with a very high level of income could afford a car of this class, moreover equipped according to the complex needs of a disabled person. Don knew about it firsthand because the boy's father often told him that there was a person with the same features in his environment. "Gorg, my goodness, how glad I am to see you here." Dan saw another man with a cane run up to the man with age and snow-white hair. It was William's father, apparently having arrived here with the rest of the guests. "What brings you here, Gorge? I hope you're all right." The businessman kept fussing over the Mercedes driver. "Yes, everything is all right. Taylor, I brought my daughter to your party. She asked me very much to escort her to the party." Nikki's father gave Dan such a stern look that his wrist even shook. "Wow, your daughter is beautiful. She looks like the Duchess of Cambridge." William's father continued to flatter him. "By the way, forgive me for being so casually. I wanted to ask, our contract for next year is still in force. There's not going to be any change in payment." Nikki's father began to answer him something, and Dan just stared at the whole picture in amazement. If his father was so flattering to this paratrooper, it meant that the real kings of the princesses of this town had come to their party, and they were richer than all of them put together. Gorge, from a young age, had been a man of honor, having spent his childhood and youth in an orphanage. He knew even then that his primary mission on this earth would be to protect the poor and oppressed. Little Gorge's parents died in a terrible fire while traveling on a cruise ship on the ocean. The boy was briefly raised by his grandmother, but then she was gone, and the boy was taken to social services. So from the age of 3.5, the child ended up in an orphanage, where there were only long years of cold winter nights ahead of him because of the economy on heating and frequent nagging from the other boys. Gorge's biggest dream was that one day people who looked just like his mom and dad would come for him. When they saw the boy, they would immediately want to adopt him because he reminded them madly of someone, but they can't remember who. He lived with this dream until he was 11, when he realized no one would come for him at all. The realization was not easy for the child. The last Nikki faded in him like a ray at sunset, and nothing good seemed to lie ahead for the boy. It was all by chance. One day, walking at the local playground with his group, Gorge stood up for a little girl. She could not fight off the bullies. The other kids were older, about the same age as Gorge, and were desperately taunting the tiny girl, trying to take away her old teddy bear. Then he rattled those two so they remembered him for a long time. The boy put in his childhood emotional punches, all the pain and frustration that had caught up with him over the past few months. Retreating back, one of them shouted at him, "Yeah, you're wild," and he loved it. From that moment on, he discovered a new and much more realistic path with which to tie his life. The path of the protector. After graduating from boarding school, Gorge, who was already 18 at the time, went to the military recruitment office himself and asked to volunteer for the front. While he was a civilian, he managed to get a fiancée. The girl was brought up in the same orphanage as him, but she wanted to study and her fiancé to fight. But Lucy, as her lover's name was, promised that she would wait for him no matter what it cost her. Times were difficult at the time. That's why after a short training, the young fighter was thrown into one of the hottest war spots. The boy fought for several years in a row until one day he was ambushed along with his team. It was in the mountains and the highway between the rocks. The convoy suddenly came under mortar fire. The shell hit just the car where Gorge was riding. "Wild, wild," shouted the squad leader to him when he was about to lose consciousness. Wild had just become his working call sign. Just don't pass out, don't pass out, don't pass out, don't pass out, thinking about home and the bride. Think, don't you dare die. Afterwards there was darkness and a flowing deep pain below the waist. When the officer regained consciousness in a military hospital, it turned out that his right leg had been amputated. It was a forced decision. Otherwise, the young soldier could have died from blood loss. At first, all he felt was shock. He could not believe that he could no longer walk, run, or fight normally. At night, the man was plagued by phantom pains. It seemed to him that his leg was in place, only hurting unbearably. It was as if all the muscles in it had been twisted outward with meat. The surgeons had to invite a middle-aged woman, military psychologist, to him, trying to prove that a practically full life would be available to him after some time, when they prepare a prosthesis. Yes, he won't be able to fight anymore. But there's a whole other peaceful life that the guy will now be able to continue in civilian life. Of course it's all right for you to talk. You've got both legs. Coldly, he said. The psychologist said nothing to this and silently left the room. The next day he was demobilized due to a serious injury. The boy was brought back to the apartment he was supposed to live in after his stay in the orphanage ended. And that filthy corner henceforth became the place where he apparently strengthened himself, sobbing at night. And once he even wanted to end his life, but he was saved by an elderly neighbor who decided to go to the boy's house for salt at such a bad time. Gorge had one last hope, his fiancée, who had been waiting all this time for his return. He deliberately did not write to her about what had happened. He wanted her to accept him for who he was. The only thing the former paratrooper wanted to wait until the moment when he was made a full-fledged prosthesis. He did not want to appear before his beloved on ugly crutches. And that day came. Somehow, having taken the uncomfortable prosthesis, Gorge bought a bouquet of large roses from the remains of his military pension and hurried to see his beloved. The girl opened the door for him and immediately threw herself into his arms. You could see that she was really happy. "Alive," continued without stopping, repeated Lucy. At the same time, she kissed his cheek, the neck, and every inch of his face. "Gorge, how glad I am that you're back." "Wait." He stopped the flow of the outpouring. "I'm alive. I'm alive." Except he twisted his pant leg to show her his prosthesis. The smile on the girl's face immediately faded. She felt sorry for him and took him inside, where the couple had tea and talked for hours. However, their relationship did not work out. Lucy endured a year trying to get used to the disabled guy. and Gorge was in no hurry to ask the girl to remarry. He felt that for sure an ice wall had grown between them. Everything seems to be fine, but the former feelings that were between them before they went into the army are no longer there. As a result, on New Year's Eve, the young people broke up. He realized that she didn't need him without a leg, and Lucy that he can't really to live peacefully with her disabled husband. I have to give the girl credit. They parted peacefully without scandals. That's how he got on with his life. Alone, after the story with Lucy, he couldn't take it anymore. He began to drink, first a little at a time, then got mixed up with a bad company of drunks and began to lose his entire pension over and over again, until at last he got so deep in debt that he had to sell his only apartment for his debts. For several years he practically lived on the street. So bad were his affairs, huddling in basements, tormented by memories of the past, and every time he was haunted by the same nightmare of their car, exploding and his bloody leg flying off to the side. He woke up screaming and in a cold sweat almost every night. Finally, he was found accidentally on a park bench by a former military comrade. He had been a radio operator at headquarters and had often helped out the troops, in the most seemingly intractable conflicts. This friend roused the drunkard a little and first of all took him to his house, fed him, made him wash, cleaned and greased his prosthesis, even though he didn't ask for it. And it was because of this that Gorge gradually began to return to normal life. He led him practically by the hand to the city's Veterans Affairs Committee, and after some time, after reviewing all the documents in the situation, he was given a cozy little room not far from the center. Through an adaptation program after his injury, he trained at the employment center as a plumber and soon began working at the local housing and utilities office. Things began to get better. The former paratrooper was even given a new, much more comfortable prosthesis, so it became a little easier for him to walk. He was adjusting after all. A couple of months later, the man met a wonderful woman named Ross. She worked as a letter carrier in their neighborhood, delivering pensions and subscriptions. She felt sorry for the ex-military man, and he was a good man. By that time, he just missed the human and female warmth. That is why things worked out so well between him and Ross. They began to live together. Later they got married without a big ceremony, but with real feelings. One day, walking through the station, I noticed a little girl. She was running around the platform, offering flowers of the field to passers-by and singing children's songs, begging them for food. "Where did you come from?" Gorge asked her affectionately. "There is such a village," replied little girl. "My mother died recently, and my stepfather drinks every day. So even if you don't go home, there's nothing to eat, so I came here by electric train. And I'll give you a flower for it." Gorge started crying. He felt so sorry for the girl. He remembered himself too. How he wandered the streets as a boy and starved to death in the orphanage. He decided to take the girl in, especially since Ross was not against it. And so Nikki came into their family, a girl with curly hair and dark, ripe cherry eyes. They quickly got the paperwork done and officially adopted the girl. The stepfather gave up his parental rights easily for a small sum and a couple of bottles. Now, Nikki's happiness was not interfered with by anything. They began to live as one close, knit family. However, they still could barely make ends meet. Nikki was constantly laughed at school because she spent years wearing things she bought at yard sales and cheap flea markets. Her mother fought as hard as she could, but it wasn't enough. On a letter carrier's and a plumber's salary, there wasn't much room for maneuvering. That's when Gorge pulled himself together and decided to change his life completely. The first thing he did was to get in touch with his former colleagues. Those who were already civilian began to find out how soon he was able to get a job as a security guard at a private agency. And that's where it went from there. Gorge worked practically around the clock to the sweat. Soon the first serious money came into the family, and with the help of his war buddies, he was able to open his first security agency of his own. The firm was small and modest, but brought a steady income, and that was only the beginning. Gradually, the network of security firms grew so large that all the most influential citizens of the city began using the services of his company exclusively. At the same time, he preferred not to brag about his wealth and status. He led the same humble life with his wife and daughter without any show-off. Soon, all the politicians, businessmen, and even the mayor were already served by a system of security firms that organized both security events and the installation of video surveillance and alarm system. The name became known in wide social circles, but was not mentioned as often due to his desire to remain more incognito. He thought it would be better for the safety of his family as well. When the first big money arrived, the first thing he did was to build a large family mansion with it, and order that very Mercedes with special control, which he drove to the club that evening. Nikki actually had everything a modern young girl could dream of. However, her father had accustomed her to modesty, and Nikki herself did not have the vice of ubiquitous consumerism, so she could easily do without excessive luxury. She valued decency, intelligence, and kindness more than anything else, and she never gave priority to her financial situation. That is why she became so furious when she heard the story of Robert's words. That day, when she received an invitation to a party in the mail, the girl immediately suspected that all was not clear. After contacting her student friends, she managed to find out that she had to wear a certain dress code on the party. Realizing that she was probably going to be humiliated in public, Nikki persuaded her father to help her by telling him about coming out of Mala. Of course, when he found out about all the bullying of the students, he spared neither time nor money to get his daughter ready for the ball properly. Mom naturally helped out too. By that time, she was already a respected woman in the community, ready to listen and help everyone who turned to her for help. Together with her husband, they were also involved in charity, sponsoring private orphanages and patronage helping poor people of the arts. Making inquiries among her girlfriends, the wives of high-ranking officials. The woman quickly figured out the theme of the party and learned about the idea with the masks. That's how they got the idea to show these majors. Who they have at university a real lioness who is only a trio of cowardly lambs. This is just the right time. Brian arrives from another business trip to America and, hearing about what has happened, personally volunteered to take Nikki to the club. However, Gorge himself insisted on the trip. He was very curious to see those who had put themselves above laws, morality, and human respect. Now, looking at the former paratrooper who had become a real multimillionaire from a very important position in society, a bunch of highlifes finally realized what a mistake they had made in deciding to humiliate his own daughter. Suddenly, William felt someone grab him roughly by the scruff of the neck. It was his father, glaring angrily at his son and his cronies as well, and Gorge hissed in his ear with spittle and rage. "What do you think you're doing, puppy? I've been told here by kind people. What are you up to? Are you trying to pull a prank on my daughter? You're a half-assed prankster. I'll show you how to fuck with respectable people. I'll have all your cards blocked. And no more summer vacations in Ibiza, got it? You're gonna be a goddamn flamer on the farm. Until you deserve it, you don't get any more from me." His father told him, "You know it." "You what?" He tried to justify himself. "I didn't know who she was. Why is she dressed like that? That he's a marginalist. Looks like a marginalized person. Are you out of your mind? Did you see how much of a fiancé this marginalist is? Brian himself. He's got more money than all the deputies in the Capitol, and there's more to put on top of it. All right, here's the deal. Today is your last day. We'll have one last good time, but then go straight home. And don't you dare even look in her direction. Do you understand me?" Yeah, Dad, don't be silly. What a bunch of youngsters. You give them comfort, and they stab you in the back. And you, he looked menacingly at the rest of the boys. Your parents will know tomorrow about all the amusements of the Institute. If you would be kind enough to answer to them, you'll have to answer to the full extent of the parental law. With these words, the man once again looked at his son, and then eloquently knocked on his gold watch, so that by 12 o'clock sharp at home was clear to you. The businessman hurried away to his car, and at that time in the club, young people were having a good time, not even aware of the passions that had played out just a few minutes before at the entrance. Humiliated young rich people. Slowly they walked to the farthest end of the lower floor, where they preferred to spend the evening without speaking to anyone in particular. Naturally, their plan to record another prank fiasco. After the appearance of Nikki and her famous companion, as well as an equally respectable father, all the attention of the guests was focused only on them. Now, each of the majors sat thinking about how he was going to have to justify himself to his own parents, who had been promised an account of all their social activities. William sat with a perfectly still, pale face. The others, seeing their leader's condition, were silent, not daring to utter a word lest they should make him more angry. The gilded chairs on the pedestal were empty, with no one to sit in them. A true king never goes out to entertain a crowd, and those who do recognize themselves as more of a buffoon than worthy of true power. Instead, Nikki, Brian, and Gorge sat in a specially equipped box. William's father made sure they were handed the best viewing seats. Watching the movements from above the dancing crowds, Nikki genuinely rejoiced. Not only was she able to teach the student trolls a lesson, but she was also able to prove to her father that she could stand the test of wealth. She loved him and her mother always, and would never allow teasing them, no matter what circumstances surrounded her family. They were poor, but they became rich. But they always remained men of honor with protectors, guarding the peace and sanity of all those who were weak and unable to stand up to the greedy and brazen predators who lived in the depths of the urban jungle, and Nikki truly believed that now it would always be so.